Okay.
Should we wait for a minute or shall we get started?
It's up
Yeah, I
to you.
think,
You're the
yeah, we
second
could.
officer.
Yeah, I think we can just start with some introduction here. So my name is Pawan. I'm a section officer here at IEEE Palu section. We do have some other officers here along with me, Dr. Brian Johnson, Asad Muhammad, and uh, Daniel Contadeleon, Dr. Daniel Contadeleon. He's also our section officer. So yeah, we are from IEEE Palu section. So we are majorly dominated with the student members here in this section. So we do have good audience for these kind of talks. So last year we used to do all the in-person sessions, but with the restrictions around, we started doing these online events, which turned out to be pretty good for us. We had a very good audience so far. Last year we did a series on microgrid topics and we had very good response on that. So we wanted to continue with that idea and we started with this cybersecurity series in this year. So we'll be having a few more talks on the same subject. So we will be posting all the recordings onto our YouTube channel. So we are in the process of some transition between our previous officers to right now. So yeah, you will have more information about the section on our website. I'll be sharing the information in the chat about the website and also our LinkedIn and Facebook groups. So where we will be posting most of our information. And with that, I will let Dr. Brian Johnson to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you. So our speaker today is Jeff Pack, who is specializes in cybersecurity services for Power Engineers Incorporated. He has over 28 years of experience in electric utilities, energy research and development, and information security solutions. He has bachelor's degrees in engineering and computer science from Montana Tech and an MBA from Boise State University. And so he's going to give us our lead-off talk for this, and it's going to be an introduction to physical and cybersecurity threats to power systems. So I'll turn it over to Jeff.
All right, thanks, Brian. I'm going to go ahead and share a screen, hopefully. Oh, it says host disabled. So.
Assad, are you the host?
Oh, yes, just a second. I'm going to check on the rights. Could you try now, please?
That looks better. Okay, assuming you guys can see it now, right?
Yes, we can.
Okay, well, thanks, Brian, for a gracious introduction. As we go through this, my intent was to make this interactive. So if there's a question or something, feel free to say something or let me know that you have a question. But what I really wanted to kind of go over was power system threats, and then a couple of case studies that I think illustrate those threats. I'm kind of an applied science person. I like theory, but I'd rather apply it to the real world and see how things go. So that's my perspective on what we're going to talk about today anyway. So let me get the pointer working. But as I said, as we go through this, feel free to to ask questions. So just a few slides talk about some definitions and terms as we go first, and then we'll go right into the case studies and hopefully give you some information on threats to the power system. And again, we're covering both physical and cyber because I think they're both worth talking about, because from I focus a lot on cyber, but that doesn't mean that the physical threats any less, and in some cases it's probably higher. So I think they're both very important to cover from an overall security view of the bulk power system. So as we, like I said, we'll go forward. Usually start out with some little discussion about risk, because when you look at this, cybersecurity, physical security, all of those things from a business perspective, it's really about managing risk. And so we kind of have to put that into context for everything that we do is, how do we manage risk for the organization, whether it's a business, whether it's a utility, whether it's, an organization, like IEEE Palouse, there's obviously, it's the risks are much different, but everyone has to have that kind of discussion about how do we manage risk. And so this is an equation that I've seen before and used. Risk is really a product of threats, vulnerabilities, and the asset value. And a lot of times, especially in the cyber world, it's hard to determine what asset value is. So we do a more of a qualitative risk assessment rather than a quantitative, because we don't have a very good value on things like intellectual property or reputation damage if someone breaks into your system. And then some, we have to talk just a little bit about risk management. We have to assess it. We have to understand how much risk is in that whatever we're looking at, whether it's the power system or some other thing that we're looking at. And then we have to, again, put that risk into context. And there's some risk that we just really can't do much about. I mean, we really have no way to come up with a mitigation for it. So those are risks that we kind of just monitor. We might have some type of ability to look for that, but we don't really have a way to mitigate that completely. And then there's other risks that we can respond to, and those are usually addressed through what we call security controls. And they're different from control systems, but they're really the steps that we can take to mitigate a risk. And those are things like, they can be processes like a vulnerability assessment process that looks for vulnerabilities on a system. It could be a technical solution. It could be like a firewall. And of course, then there's also training, which is kind of the people part of it. If we train our folks to recognize things like phishing or other types of malicious code that may show up in your inbox or on your web page, that's also a way to respond and to mitigate that risk. So just to kind of put that into perspective, but obviously we're gonna look at threats to both physical and cyber to the power grid. So what are threats? And this is always an interesting conversation, at least for me, because we hear a lot of talk about patching software and there's vulnerabilities in software, but the thing about a threat is that, at least in the software world, there's a lot of them that we don't know about. They're like, they're sitting out there until someone discovers them, right? So software flaws are flaws that are there before they're discovered, and then they become a vulnerability. And so they're really kind of hard to measure, because we all know that there's lots of opportunity to have software flaws. We do our best to write good code and to do the right things with respect to software development. But software flaws are still a big risk, or a big threat, sorry. And so I put this at the top, but it's not necessarily, these aren't in, priority order. Let's look a little more at the physical. So we also have material theft. So, the price of copper, it kind of goes up and down, but there's always the threat of someone stealing copper out of either a substation or a generation facility. It's still pretty valuable. So there's still a lot of material theft, and of course, some of the devices in a control house are pretty valuable too. So then we have vandalism, which is really just, maybe they do physical damage to the substation or to, some equipment. And, we don't know what their motivation is. So we kind of just term it vandalism, just because we don't really have any idea what motivated them to do that damage. And then of course we have what we're calling nation states, and there's probably not a lot of physical threats that are nation state, because they require a lot of local access to that facility, but they're still there. I mean, we still have them on the list. And of course, terrorism is another one that we kind of associate with nation states in general. And there's some of this that's definitely happening throughout the world. Probably more, it gets more attention on the cyber side right now, but there's still physical terrorism happening. And then a special case I want to mention is the insider threat. Now, this is someone that has, been granted, the privilege to access the physical location. They have permission to do that, so it's not unauthorized access like we talk about a lot with access control. But so these people are, they have, some of their motivation besides, working for that particular, company or utility or whatever. And for some reason, they've decided to take action and, impact things negatively. So the insider threat is definitely big, and it's one of the hardest threats to really do much about, because if the person who is, responsible for the inside threat really wants to cover their tracks there, and then they're probably pretty good at it. So this one is always one that comes up in threat conversation. And then of course on the cyber side, of course we still have software flaws, but we change up the theft a little bit. We're more focused on intellectual property as far as what that theft might be. Then of course similar threats on the cyber side as nation states, which we've all heard about cyber attacks, and we'll again do one of the case studies, cyber terrorism, which you might lump some of the recent things. I guess solar winds would probably be a nation state attack. I think the investigation has shown that those attacks really started in Russia. I don't think they would be termed terrorism, but they could be involved some intellectual property theft. Then, of course, the insider threat also on the cyber side, someone that has, privileged access to the power system could really, cause a lot of damage. So just wanted to go over those threats really quick. Is there any questions before we go to the first case study? Okay. So, and some of you may have heard about these, so, and hopefully I can give you some additional information. But if you have, things that you want to contribute to that, feel free. This first case study is the physical security one. It's short is Metcalf, but it's the Metcalf transmission substation owned by Pacific Gas and Electric, and it's located in just south of San Jose, California. So those of you that are familiar with the Bay Area, you might have seen this driving on 101. You can see the 101 freeway goes right by the substation. So it's, again, just after you leave San Jose, but before you get to Gilroy, that's you'll see that big substation on the west side of the highway. So this is a major sub for PG&E. Is, there's a little bit. This isn't a. I don't think this is a complete diagram of all the lines, because they don't have the 110 kV lines listed here. But this is the best I could find on the internet as far as a diagram of what we see at Metcalf. But they definitely have 500 kV lines, coming in. These red lines are 500 kV. So Moss Landing is a big gas turbine plant about 80 miles south. There's a gas turbine plant called Metcalf that's very close to the substation also. And then, the Tesla, I don't know if that's just a line to the factory, because they have a factory in Fremont. But you can see there's a pretty good section of 500 kV lines coming into Metcalf, these three. And then, of course, there's transformers that go down to 230 and then 230 to 115. And those lower voltage transformers make up the bulk of this. This is the 230 kV lines. But if you're familiar with that Bay Area, there's probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 million people that are in the South Bay and the peninsula. So there's a big population, and this is one of the major substations that serves the South Bay. So what happened here? Well, on April 16th, 2013, started about 1 o'clock in the morning. They noticed that their communications to the substation went down. Of course, they're pulling SCADA points and probably have engineering access to a lot of devices there. And they noticed that their communications went out. And it turns out that there are underground vaults for the major communication vendors there. I think in this case, there was Level 3 and maybe AT&T. But those underground vaults were both, they weren't secured properly. So, they may have been locked, but they weren't locked very well. And all those fiber optic lines were cut in the vault. And the vault is outside of the substation perimeter fence. So of course, even their redundant fiber connections got cut. So they lost all their communications. And then, of course, the big attack that you guys may have heard about is the transformer radiators were shot. And about 57, that's the last number that I was able to find. Well over 100 shots fired and 58,000 gallons of oil spilled from those radiators. So there's still, the threat, it was either terrorism or vandalism. It's still really unknown. I think that the federal agents have determined that it probably wasn't terrorism, but yeah, it's still officially still an unsolved crime. So what happened? What else? What were some of the issues during the event? So I think it was in 2016. Up at the PIAC conference that Washington State has had in Spokane, but they had one of the executives from PG&E up there. I think it was 2016, but they gave a very good talk on this whole thing, and they were pretty open about all the timeline and everything that had happened. But one of the big issues they mentioned was communications. And of course, I mentioned that the communication fibers had been cut. But the other thing was this misunderstanding of terminology. And I thought it was really interesting, so I wanted to share it with you. when the when the report of what happened ended up at the security basically headquarters for PG&E, the message was they're taking out our 500 kV transformers. Now the physical security guys are, really they don't know, everything about the power system. So they think that these things are being like stolen, like dragged out of the yard. Not knowing that a 500 kV transformer, is a huge piece of equipment, and you can't really move it unless you have like the biggest crane in the world. So the physical security guys thought that people were stealing them, but of course when the operators heard about it, they understood that they're being taken offline for in this case low oil signals. But they obviously they had different reactions. The physical security guys are trying to figure out how they got through the fence, and the operators, and once they understood that there were guns involved, determined they just shot holes in the radiators. So yeah, I thought that was a really interesting point that they mentioned. So why were they so successful with their attack, other than they cut the communication lines? But well, their physical controls that they had at the substation when the attack happened, well, they just weren't that great. And just being honest, the fencing that they had was chain link fence, so you could see through it, and it was really installed too close to the equipment. You could, if you stayed hidden, you could get within 50 yards, and that's a pretty easy shot for someone. So the fencing was too close. They did have video cameras, video surveillance, but the cameras were looking at the at the substation itself. They weren't looking out. I think I have this one a little bit wrong, but in my slide, but they were focused on things inside the substation. They were looking for physical crimes of theft and things like that in the sub, but they weren't really looking at the perimeter of the substation. So that was an issue, because they never got any video of who was doing the shooting. And then of course they had a lot of vegetation just outside the fence, and that was also blocking their view. So they could hide behind a shrub or tree or something and be pretty confident that they weren't going to be identified. And then the other thing that they brought up in the presentation that I thought was really interesting is that they had signs on the transformers and the circuit breakers identifying which lines they were associated with, because it was a big substation. And so I could see them getting a little confused about that if they had not been there before. But the signs identified which lines. So, they knew exactly what to aim for because they could read the signs. It wasn't very hard. And again, I mentioned that comm vaults weren't locked or alarmed. So that made it pretty easy for them to interrupt the communications and not really have anyone look at it seriously for about an hour until they actually started to hear gunfire. So what did PG&E do after this? So they've done a lot. They spend a lot of money on Metcalf, over $15 million just for that one substation to harden it physically. So of course they moved the fencing out to the property boundary, and it's basically a solid, either some type of concrete block or some other ballistic material that, you can't see through it, so it's hard to aim at anything. And then it is ballistic material, so if you just shoot, normal ammunition at it, it's just going to, either get embedded in it or ricochet off. So the video surveillance, they greatly increased that. They monitor both inside and outside of the fences. so that they know who's approaching, and they cleared all the vegetation out so that they have a clear line of sight out of the substation now. And they also have some what they call gunshot detectors, basically microphones that are tuned to detect, the audio frequency of normal gunshots, and then that reports back to their control center. And of course, they locked and alarmed the comm vaults, so it's really hard to get in there now. So they did a lot of work on Metcalf, but the reason I bring Metcalf up is because this particular incident had long-term ramifications for the bulk electric system. This caused NERC to issue a complete new NERC SIP standard, standard 14, SIP 14, that's focused solely on physical security of transmission substations. And it's a fairly, I kind of abbreviated the things that need to be done, but the first thing they need to do is do a transmission reliability model, basically a study to determine an N-1 impact of losing that station on the rest of the system. And then of course that has to be reviewed and approved by a third party. And then they have to develop a security plan that's fairly comprehensive, and that's also required to be reviewed by a third party to make sure that they're covering all the aspects of physical security at that site. And then they have a 5-year review cycle that has to happen. So every 5 years they have to go through all those steps again, and basically redo their security plan, redo their reliability model. So any questions? I think I think there's one more slide. Yeah, so I did the Google Maps, basically the road view thing, and so you can see the fence now. It's a, it looks like about a, 15-foot, maybe 20-foot fence, and it's all solid, and that's the view from 101. So any questions on Metcalf? And I'm assuming that a lot of you have maybe heard of it and maybe not gone through it in depth, but it's a pretty good case study for the physical side.
So just a note for the audience in general, if you want to put questions in the chat, we can also pass those on to Jeff. And I do have 2 quick questions for you, Jeff.
Okay.
So I've actually, years before this happened, I remember talking to some people kind of talking about hypothetical situations like this. And one of the questions that also came up is how do you handle it if the substation is down low, so you have hills around it in one or other directions?
Yeah. So there's several, of course, utilities, including, some of our clients who asked us that question too. Basically, hey, my substation's really sitting in a kind of a little valley, and all I have to do is climb up this hill or this mountain, and I can see everything. How do I do that? So one of the things that we've seen those utilities do to kind of harden, especially the transformers, is to build additional firewalls around them. And a lot of them have firewalls already to stop fire from jumping from one to another. But we've seen them add either additional firewalls or put some ballistic metal, especially in front of the radiators. Now it's still got to give them some airflow. So there's some design things that have to be worked out. But we have seen some ballistic protection for those sensitive things that kind of extend up over, and so it blocks the line of sight from a lot of those places. Now, the classic thing that I always ask is, well, what about drones? And that's still a tough one, because you can drop a drone into the substation and if it's got a stick of dynamite on it, that could be pretty lethal too. But that's what I've seen, Brian, is basically they do a line of sight study, and then they kind of prioritize what equipment would be damaged from a particular location, and they'll put the ballistic metal or the firewalls around it. So.
Okay, well, with the drones, you actually answered my next question.
Oh, okay.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and one other thing, just on subs in general, as land gets more expensive, we're starting to see a trend of adding more gas insulated substations, GIS. And the nice thing from a security standpoint about GIS is that they usually build those with a building over everything, because they're compact enough that I can put a metal building, and it's really meant to cut down on corrosion and to keep the flanges and everything for the GIS gear to stay airtight with SF6 gas. That's the insulating gas that's used in GIS. But the side benefit is that building really is a great visual block, right? No one can see the switch gear. So I think GIS has a little side benefit, as it does add some additional physical security. So. All right, any other questions on Metcalf?
I'm sorry,
All
there
right.
was one question in the chat
Okay.
by Rahul. It says, how much time it took to repair all the systems and transformer? Was it a single phase or 3-phase? Either replacing the single phase transformer would be easier.
Yeah. So fortunately, they didn't have to replace the entire transformer. They had to replace the radiators for the most part. Replace or repair. It did take several months to get all that equipment repaired, and then the mitigating controls took probably another 18 months, like the new fence, with the solid walls and all the other things that they put in the video and things like that. So yeah, it did take them several months. The interesting thing though is that even with all those transformers that they took out, PG&E has a pretty robust system. They did not have a power outage, even with all that damage at Metcalf. They had redundant paths for a lot of that, those lines that got impacted. So and they had to scramble. They said they were kind of close, but they did not have an outage. So that was pretty interesting. So. Okay. Any more in the chat? I'm sorry, I lost my big window here because I'm presenting. But all right. Well, let's go on to the second one. So, and again, this one, I'm sure that you've heard of it a little bit. I've spent some time looking at the Ukraine attack from 2015. And so I would just want to share with you some thoughts that I have on that one. This is a cyber case study. So this picture is from the SEL presentation that they presented at PIAC in 2017. These are the three regions that were impacted by the attacks. They're all in the kind of the western part of Ukraine. And I think that also, especially this one, which is where the capital is, Kiev. We'll talk a little bit more about the actual threat. But so December 23rd, 2015, they had approximately 60 distribution substations taken offline. About 250,000 customers went without power. And then the way they did it is that the intruders got into the control system remotely, and they had full control of anything that had HMI control. So all the circuit breakers for those 60 stations, they had some form of control. But they didn't stop there. They didn't just trip lines. They also disabled uninterruptible power systems. They also did a denial of service attack on the telephone system. So if people were trying to call in with lights out messages, they couldn't talk to the power companies. And maybe even the most devastating thing is they had a lot of equipment that had serial to Ethernet protocol converters, so that they could manage them with a more modern SCADA system and control system. And the intruders flashed those protocol converters with some malicious firmware that basically bricked those protocol converters. They wouldn't work and you couldn't restore them. They turned them into junk. So that was a pretty devastating attack. Of course, the threat here was nation state, and it took officials took a while to basically declare that Russia had done this, but they ended up basically saying that in multiple reports. The thing about this particular attack is that it started a long time before December of 2015. It started nearly 9 months previous to that. They had basically sent spearphishing emails to several people at the utilities, and they had gained their access credentials. And so they were in and they were mapping everything for months before they actually executed the attacks. So I do have a video that I want to play for you, and I did check the audio share, so hopefully you'll be able to hear this, but even if you can't, you can still get the gist of the video through the through the text on the video, and then there's some what do I want to say? You'll just see what I mean. So here we go. Hopefully you guys can still see that.
А що це він зараз робить? Чого ржете?
Це воно секційний щось.
Він
110 хоче. Що хоче відключити?
Спроба вимкнути секційний 110 кВт. Він у нас не заведений під телемеханіку.
Ні, ми тут не маємо.
Ні, він не заведений взагалі-то під телемеханіку, але спроба це зробити є.
Це от зараз треба вирубати. Горочана така є штука, але в них там заведено. А Горчана мешка не робить.
Ні, це від моїх справився самого комп'ютері.
Ні, воно весь час.
Горчани.
І що, це другий раз пробує зробити 110?
А до айтішників.
А може це айтішники роблять?
So hopefully you guys were able to hear that and see it. Can you tell me if you were? Hopefully you did.
Yeah, we did.
Okay. So, you can see that, the attackers had, remote desktop protocol, whatever, that the HMI was running, most likely, a form of Microsoft Windows. and they were able to basically manipulate the control system. And pretty interesting that he was fast enough on the draw to capture that video. So for all of that, the biggest issue of this attack was the fact that their access control was awful. They were able to basically, like I said, spearfish for accounts, and when those accounts were compromised and they got into the system, they discovered that there really wasn't a bunch of separation between their business network and their operational network that had access to all the control systems, and they used the same account credentials on both sides. So there was really, once they had one set, it was game over. They really had access to everything they needed. But I guess I'll kind of just open it up, as you guys, like I said, most of you have probably heard of this before. Any other issues that you've either read about or heard about that you want to share about this event?
I'm not sure if this is right, but one of the things I heard was they had weak passwords.
I'm sorry, they had what?
Weak password security.
Yeah, I think that's probably true too. Now, it's kind of hard to tell, based on, we have really limited insight into that. I know we sent a team over there, but there were, some restrictions on what they were able to share back. But it's my understanding that, yeah, the passwords were weak. And obviously, if they were able to get into any type of administrative function, either on the Windows domain or some other area, they could really just have their way with the system. So yeah, but for all that damage, it really is kind of interesting that it really came down to access control. And it seems like the longer I do this, the more that a lot of these types of attacks that happen, the thing they break most of the time is, like you said, the passwords, or getting someone to change something so that makes it easy for them to get in. And that's the first line of defense. I mean, we always talk about setting up accounts, changing default passwords on equipment. So when you install that new relay, you need to change the passwords, something different than otter tail, right? So anyway, pretty interesting that's that was how they got in. And as far as the remediation, now we don't have a lot of information, but I've sat through a couple of presentations by SANS and some other organizations that were involved in doing the forensics on it. The probably the brightest spot out of all of that was that because they had the substations didn't have everything automated. So some of those substations were staffed already, and then they staffed the other ones that had been compromised, with either operators or engineers or some type of technician, and they were able to get power back within, I think 5 or 6 hours. It wasn't very long to have a major event like that, but they went, they staffed them out, they sent people out there, and they operated the substation manually. And they ended up doing that for quite a while they got the equipment replaced. So I mentioned those protocol converters. They had a lot of time to swap all those things out. So they replaced the compromised equipment. And then I'm sure that they went through and did a pretty good assessment of their access control system, controls and what they needed to do from an account management perspective. Probably updated a lot of things there, and of course enforced strong passwords, maybe even multi-factor authentication. We don't have those details, but kind of have to read between the lines to see what they did. So again, what are the long-term ramifications from this attack? So this was the first known interruption of a commercial power system using a cyber attack. Now there may have been others that didn't make the news, but this is the one that kind of proved the concept that everyone knew was possible. Going all the way back to the Aurora test at Idaho National Laboratory, where they destroyed the generator. Everyone knew that you could interrupt the power system, but this was an actual attack. And I also think that this raised the awareness, at least in the power system community, that nation state threats are real. I had spent some time in with Idaho National Lab in the past as an employee, and so I knew those threats were real. But I also knew that utilities in general didn't really think that they would be targeted with that. But this one made it real for everyone. And it also, I think in my mind, we really need to focus on response and recovery because, and I'm trying not to be too negative, but attacks will happen. People are going to break into your system eventually. And even if you do all the right things, there may be a 0-day, threat that turns into a vulnerability when it's discovered, and you just won't be able to defend yourself that well. So you really need to focus on how quickly you can respond and how quickly you can bring the system back on. And I think we learned a lesson from some of that, is that sometimes it takes human effort, to send people out to the subs and run them manually for a while, if that's what it takes. So yeah, lots of lessons learned from Ukraine. So I think that I'm probably about out of time. I might have gone a little over, but hopefully these case studies helped you a little bit, gave you a little more perspective on the threats to the bulk electric system. But any questions or comments, anything that you have on that, I'm more than happy to try and address.
So you talked a little bit about the NERC rulemaking in response to Metcalf. What do you see as things are progressing with the NERC SIP requirements? I think it might be even worth giving a little bit of background in the fact that these came in because of relying on the utilities to self-police wasn't working.
Yeah, no, I can give you the 2-minute history on NERC SIP, but so yeah, you're absolutely right, Brian. Back in 2003, we had a major blackout in the Northeast, and the industry had been looking at security standards. That event was not caused by a security threat. It was actually vegetation, but what it did is kind of tip the scales at FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to start to engage NERC as an enforcement body. Prior to that, NERC was a strictly volunteer organization. It was focused on obviously reliability, but it really wasn't looking at cybersecurity. And until they had the Northeast blackout, and then the kind of the realization hit that, hey, we should really look at this. And so in about 4 or 5 years after that, we started to see the NERC SIP standards get published, and the first version was pretty basic. It was there was definitely a a line drawn between systems that were in scope and systems that weren't. And there were some, bright line criteria is what NERC called it. And basically it said, if you have transmission subs that have routable communications and are above a certain voltage, then they're in. And there was a lot of discussion about, well, we're going to disconnect our substations and go back to serial connections and to avoid that. And there were some utilities that did that. And then in the past, probably, well, it went into effect in 2016, but what's commonly known as SIP version 5 added a lot more structure to the NERC SIP standards. And it started to address, obviously some lessons learned from what we just talked about in this case study, that there needs to be more security controls put in place, and it can't just be limited to things that have routable communications. So they came up with some additional criteria. They included generation systems for the first time. And they also have steadily increased the number of systems under scope. So I see that trend continuing, where they have additional requirements for systems that are kind of on the low end of the risk spectrum, but they still have access to the bulk electric system. So there's still things like access controls, and especially on any type of communications systems and physical access controls. Those are both now in place for anything, any assets that could impact what the bulk electric system. And there's some criteria for that, but yeah, in a nutshell, they really ramped that up in the past 6 or 7 years. And I do think with DER and other technologies starting to take off, NERC doesn't have jurisdiction on the distribution side, but they probably will influence a lot of the state public utility commissions to add some cybersecurity controls to their, to their, I want to say jurisdiction, I guess is the best way to put it. So I do think we'll have additional controls going forward. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, thanks. Assad, are there any questions in the chat?
No, no, there haven't been any questions in the chat. I did have one quick question to ask on the NERC SIP requirements.
Okay.
So who would be held responsible, or is there any penalties for power disruption if some new substations are not complying with those physical security requirements?
Yeah. So if a utility has a facility like a new transmission substation or something like that, and they really haven't made an effort to make it compliant with NERC SIP standards. There's regional entities throughout the nation, and for Idaho, we sit in what's called WECC, W-E-C-C, and the regional entities are the ones that do the enforcement for that particular region. What they would do is that each utility has a self-reporting responsibility. So if they bring a station online and they don't they don't meet all the requirements, of course that will throw a red flag up at WECC, and because they have to approve any new connections to the bulk electric system. So if they can always send a team out to do an inspection, and of course then most utilities have a some type of NERC SIP audit every 3 or 4 years, just depending on how often they end up in the WECC cycle. but WEC is the one, at least for this area that we live in, that would have that responsibility to, determine if there was a, a substation that wasn't compliant, and then they would do the inspection and then issue a, notice of violation to the utility.
Are they also required to upgrade the old substations that way?
Yeah, anything that could impact the bulk electric system within 15 minutes. And again, there's a definition in the standard itself, but anything that's connected to the bulk electric system, usually the devices that can do that are protective relays, and then some of the communications equipment. So it's not that hard to determine what devices are in it, but it really doesn't matter how old the substation is. As far as them having to bring that up to date, they need to do that. But fortunately, the requirements, unless it's really old equipment, the requirements are pretty easy from a technical standpoint to meet. It's just that there's a lot of overhead associated with it, just because it's regulatory, right? So there's a lot of reporting, there's a lot of paperwork, and it takes a pretty significant team to maintain all that at each utility.
Thank you.
All right, anything else? I mean, I'll stop sharing in case you guys want to throw anything else up there.
Oh, I have one last question. I'm sorry about asking so many. So I know that the DOE has started having a group look at response and recovery. Where do you see things going from that side of things?
That's a good question, Brian. I think that DOE definitely has the ability to come up with some good guidance for the utilities with response and recovery. It's hard for them because they have such a hard time, securing their own systems. And I hate to say that because I used to work there, but they, it's almost like, do as I say, not do as I do. And that credibility thing is kind of hard for utilities that have been working under NERC SIP for, coming on, 12 years now, to really, say, well, who are you to tell us, what's good or bad? So it just depends how it's delivered. I think if they do, a good effort, they pull in, some industry folks to help them, come up with some common sense approaches to that, I think that'll go over well. But if they try to do it without industry participation and just try to issue something that that maybe they ask FERC to do something, that one probably won't be as well received. Just my opinion. So.
The ones I'm thinking about are some workshops that they had with people from industry and equipment vendors.
Yeah, and I think those tend to go pretty good. I know that in fact, I'm involved in, I'm on one of the panels for one of those groups, and we're having our meeting on Friday with DOE and some of the other laboratories. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But yeah, I think those get pretty, are pretty well received. They always have to go through the, reality test, I guess is the best way to put it. And, can this be something that we can implement? And, for utilities, getting something approved as a, that they can add to the rate base and get capital funding for is always a good thing, because their operational budget comes right out of their profit. So they always want to do capitalized projects. And so framing it that way will help DOE, maybe implement some of those recommendations easier. So,
Yeah, thank you.
yep.
Okay, are there any other questions from the audience? Well, hearing none, thank you, Jeff. This is a very good presentation and a very good kickoff for our series.
Yeah, well, I hope you guys got some value out of it. The sad thing is that, if we do this a year from now, I'll probably have 2 new case studies because of lots of events happening. So.
Yeah, well, thanks. It looks like people are starting to drop off, so.
All right. Well, you guys have a great evening.
You too. Thanks, Jeff.
Yep.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff.